Well, good afternoon. This is Mark Skidmore. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today's webinar, we have Aaron DeLaporte and David Ripplinger, both from North Dakota State University, and they're talking about really the higher and the lower oil prices. We had the boom and the bust, and when they started writing and doing this work, there was a boom, and now of course we have the bust where oil prices are just falling through the roof. And so they're here to talk about the Bakken oil field in North Dakota, and thinking about the challenges associated with the boom, the economic, social, environmental policy challenges, and now of course there is the bust where revenues have been cut by 40% or more. And so maybe and Aaron and David, you can take over and share your thoughts with the audience. Are you there?
This is Dave. I'm here. I ducked out for a second, but I'm back online. Yeah, so to talk a little bit about what we did and what we learned, starting out, basically I'm going to talk about what's going on in the Bakken to give everyone some background understanding of the situation, both in terms of the geology and then the economic and social impacts. And just a little background, both myself and Aaron are economists, and so we focus more on the economic impact of things, and so that's our primary issue, but there's obviously broader impacts and very important social environmental impacts associated with resource booms and busts. So I'm going to give you some background information on the Bakken and what's been going on in that part of the country. Basically, the Bakken is a tight oil formation located in North Dakota, Montana, and the province of Saskatchewan. It's been there forever, or as long as geological formations have been there. So we've known for quite some time that there was this geological formation a mile or two or three below the ground, but it just wasn't financially or economically viable to start going after it. What we've seen is technology come online that allows us to develop these resources, and many of these may be familiar to you. Horizontal drilling, the idea that we can not just go vertically, but horizontally, parallel to the surface, to drill has been a major innovation. I think one that many people are familiar with. Along with that is this idea of fracking, or breaking up the stone or the formation to allow the movement of oil and other resources with the well has been important. Here's probably the first sign of what was going on. So we saw these high oil prices, and it was not just the technology that really led to the development of the Bakken. It was these high oil prices which helped cover some of these higher, at least initial costs of oil development relative to traditional or conventional oil formations. And so on the chart on your screen, there's two things. First is the West Texas Intermediate oil price, which is the benchmark for North American oil. And then that orange line up, there's that nice little shooter there. Thank you, Rosa. This orange line is the rig count. You can see they follow each other pretty closely. We saw a little bit of a dip in oil prices in 2009. That was the result of the financial situation that impacted most of the world. Saw a dip in rig counts, which is, these are the drilling rigs to bring on new production. And then as oil prices recovered, so did this rig count, and it was almost 200 for a time there in 2013. And so that was about the time when I started doing research and work in oil, when everyone was very optimistic about the boom, or the positive benefits, positive economic benefits of the development of the formation. The next chart looks at employment and wages, so we can kind of see this rapid uptick. This oil sector employment is kind of key to what we're looking at. We saw this increase in jobs, and so if we look at that left-hand scale, it was a relatively small industry. We've had oil activity in the state for over 50 years now. A bit of a boom and a bust in the 80s. And then we saw this rapid increase in the number of individuals working in the oil sector. And it's important to note that the oil sector is actually pretty narrowly defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so there are a number of ancillary industries that move closely with it. And then, of course, there's all of the indirect impacts in the economy, all of the service jobs that go along with it, and then all of the growth that goes along with all of these jobs coming on board. So we saw this rapid increase in the number of oil sector jobs and other jobs resulting from the development of oil. And then we also saw an increase in wages, and these wages, were very, very nice, high enough for some university faculty members to think maybe I should leave campus and go drive truck for a little bit. And of course, with this, although there was, this economic benefit and some people having higher wages, there's a lot of negative things that come with this rapid development. And this is just an illustrative side of many of the things that were going on there, in this case talking about drug use. Many other issues, again, I'm an economist, but human trafficking, drugs, crime, all of those things have come with the development of the Bakken. This is a little bit difficult to see, but this is just looking at some of the costs. This story from a little over a year ago, looking at the investments that the North Dakota Department of Transportation was looking at making. And so for that biennium, which was ongoing, they're spending over $2 billion on infrastructure improvements, just road and highway improvements, which is a significant sum of money for a sparsely populated state like North Dakota. And so that kind of leads us into this convening, and eventually I'll turn this over to Aaron in just a second. There's obviously a lot of activity going on out there. There was a conversation between the Strom Center at Dickinson State University, which is located in the southern part of the Bakken, and the Minneapolis Fed about, what issues are there that we can look at as researchers that can help address some of these practical challenges that are facing these communities located in the Bakken. At this time, things are starting to slow down, but still during periods of significant economic growth and upheaval. And so between conversations between Dickinson State and the Minneapolis Fed, they decided to have a research summit or research convening. And with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Okay, so with that context, basically, we hosted this meeting, the Strom Center at Dickinson hosted it, basically to highlight completed and ongoing research in the Bakken and improve future communication among researchers to better address the interdisciplinary problems faced by communities in the Bakken moving forward. So we had this context, these important things were happening in the oil field, and they still are, and the oil is still there, so in the future they will again. But there wasn't necessarily a whole lot of communication going on between people who were working in the area. So on May 18th and 19th in 2015, we went into Dickinson, and we sat down together and basically had this convening. So we brought in people from North Dakota State University and University of North Dakota, people from South Dakota State, Montana, Minnesota. There were some state and federal government representatives and some local stakeholders. And basically the meeting was conducted using think tank technology. So think tank technology to me is a brainstorming program. So instead of breaking down into smaller working groups, getting out a whiteboard or a flip chart, and then coming back and sort of giving a report, this kind of activity was going on the whole time using think tank. So basically we had a room set up with a bunch of different laptop computers. People were able to type their responses. So there was a moderator that led each session, and basically you were able to type your, express what it is you wanted about that question. Also there was room discussion that was covered by, that was the moderators recorded some of that as well. And basically it gave this extensive report of what was going on, and it also allowed people to connect remotely to the conference. So there were a couple remote connections for some of the sessions. But mostly it was people, about 30 researchers in the room, each with a laptop. So it gave an output that looked something like this. So basically we had the question for the session. You would respond with, so what funding resources, including nonprofit organizations and foundation governmental groups, so where does funding come from? You have an idea, the Bush Foundation, USDA, questions, so you would put something down, there would be a response to that, who has gotten funding from Bush, and then a response to, a counter response point. Vision West received Bush funding, but now Bush has maybe changed their focus, so that's not really an option. So we brought together 6 different topics using this technology and sort of worked our way through some of the issues that were going on in order to have this collaborative effort to help solve these problems. I'd just like to acknowledge here some support from the Strom Center at Dickinson State University that hosted, the USDA, the North Dakota Department of Commerce, NDSU, which provided the think tank service and the moderators to do that, the NCRCRD, which helped with the travel, and the North Dakota Consensus Council. So what came of our discussions? And basically, we tackled 6 different topics: funding, data resources, fieldwork, research needs, communication and dissemination, and a possibility of a future research conference. So, in terms of funding, the questions basically were, what funding have we received? Where might we go for funding? What challenges exist for funding? Those kinds of things. So specifically, we addressed who may be interested in funding research on the economic and community impact of the Bakken, the usual suspects, federal and state agencies, different foundations. What challenges have you faced in securing funding for research projects? So competition, grants are competitive, you put a lot of time into making them, sometimes you don't get them. One of the larger concerns was if these are time-sensitive issues, often funding doesn't come in quickly. And then sort of this need for the community itself and for other collaborators to buy in. So this convening identified these problems and also perhaps poses a way to solve some of them as well. And so some of the other ways that funding challenges were overcome: grant targeting, pre-organized teams, which hopefully this kind of thing will help with, pre-organized literature review, and research. The next topic that we covered was about data resources. And basically here we're speaking of, what data is available, what data has been used, what more data do we need, and how do we access all of this data. And so what data resources have you used or plan to use as part of your projects? Large-scale data sets, survey data, municipal data. So some of the more interesting things, of course, come from, people's actual survey results, the data that they've made themselves. And an interesting sort of innovative idea, at least it seemed like to me, was the concept perhaps of tracking migration, movement, these kinds of issues using cell phone ping data. So how have the towers essentially increased their flow, and, where did these people go and where do they come from? So then we moved on to a discussion of what data resources would be helpful that are currently not available. How could we get these? And so some of the ideas that came up included well site data, so actual issues about the well sites. But of course, this was controversial in that the fact that the oil companies rarely let anyone onto their sites. So they seemed desirable and yet unachievable. Things like spatial money transfers. Where was the money from the Bakken going? Those kinds of issues, rental occupancy rates, and the amount of recoverable oil. So like Dave was saying before, technologically, that's like prices were one explanation or one reason that this came online, but another was, of course, the amount of recoverable oil, which continues to change. As technology gets better, the estimate for the amount of recoverable oil keeps increasing. The third issue that we discussed was field work. So what work has been done, what challenges have you faced, those kinds of issues. So there have been surveys conducted. There have been a number of surveys conducted in the region. A number of surveys conducted such that there's a general perception amongst all of the researchers who are there and who do fieldwork in the area that the most important issue surrounding fieldwork in the Bakken at that point was survey fatigue. That many of the groups of individuals who were of interest to all of the researchers had already been over-surveyed, if you will. So, Native American tribes, local residents, industrial and community leaders, and migrant workers have all been surveyed, and still we would like to pursue further research with long-term residents, oil workers, service providers, and different county administrators. So lots of questions from some of the local stakeholders, lots of statements of the pressure that some different people were placing on them, phoning them for sort of broad general questions that could either be easily answered or were, somewhat time-consuming on their part. The fourth issue we talked about were some of the major research needs going forward. So we addressed the question from an academic perspective, what important research questions regarding the economic and community impact of the Bakken energy boom should be investigated. So this obviously had a bunch of interesting ideas that are, sort of more easily understood through the reports or various, or through the think tank output, for example. But migration, transients, international workers, development planning, community, visas, wage rates, layoffs, non-oil businesses, who benefits, environmental degradation, emergency preparedness, long-term impacts. So a bunch of the things that you would expect were identified and, sort of listed out, fleshed out some of those problems. We also talked about communication and disseminating the academic and the various information that we gather and produce. And we sort of forwarded this sort of communication and dissemination. There's two sort of tiers to that. One is amongst researchers and one is by researchers to stakeholders. And so there were a bunch of different ideas that came forward of how we could remain connected as researchers and use sort of those synergies to help funding, to help dissemination. So through listservs, through journal articles, through news conference updates, those kinds of things, keeping everyone sort of in the loop, talking about a clearinghouse of information for Bakken research. So the final question we looked at was your research's value to local communities. What barriers exist to sharing research? How do we overcome these barriers? There was a recognition that those academic outputs need to be made relevant to those people in the community who could most effectively disseminate them. And then the final thing that we talked about was sort of a capstone to this convening was the creation of a research conference in the area to look at all of these issues. And so basically amongst those, those who were there, and those researchers interested obviously in the Bakken, we talked about what should be the goals of a public research conference, scope, who are the audience, where should it be located, how it should be organized. And so the overwhelming majority of people thought that it needed to be stakeholder relevant, that while there could be some academic outputs, that we really wanted more of an applied conference to effectively communicate those results to community stakeholders. Talked about some panel discussions with community leaders and academics. Some of what would happen would be dependent on what sort of a call for papers resulted in, and that it would be located in the Bakken region, perhaps right there at Dickinson State, sometime at the end of this year. So basically, we went into this convening, 30 researchers, we brainstormed some ideas, we talked about the issues that were arising in the Bakken. And we sort of came to this conclusion that the purpose of this thing was to communicate research in the Bakken, build towards a conference, and maintain that communication so that we could, continue doing effective research. And just as a note, that think tank technology it was certainly interesting, and I think we did a better job with it early on in the conference. It somewhat depended on who was moderating the session. And so I would say that think tank technologies, they were useful, but we didn't always use them that well in that context. We did some better jobs at times actually having discussion in the room. And as sort of the time went on, some had to leave to catch their flights, that kind of thing. The number of people in the room went down, and sort of we moved from the think tank being more effective to just general discussion being a more effective way. So I will turn this over to Dave again to talk about where we're going in the future, to talk about more about the fall, and to talk about the research conference.
Thanks, Aaron. So what's happened? So when we met in May of last year, West Texas oil was about $55, and I remember that because that's the threshold at which we used to have a trigger in the state tax code. So we were dancing around that, and I think by the end of the month it was up to $60. Right now, West Texas is somewhere around $30, plus or minus $1 or $2. I think it's still under. So substantially lower. The break-even cost of wells varies, but even for those most productive counties with the lowest cost, the break-even cost of a new well is still in the high 20s. And so there's some that are close to break-even, but what you have to note is that the price of North Dakota light sweet, which is what we actually produce most of here, it's trading at about $18 or $19, and so it's below break even, and so there's really little opportunity for continued profitable development of Bakken oil under the current price environment. So we've seen the rig count fall. Last Friday was down to 44 rigs, and so you can just basically use that as a map of the level of economic activity. Another thing that's going on is that even though we have been drilling wells, a lot of them have not been completed, and that is they haven't been fracked, they haven't been put online, and so a lot of the investment has been made, but the prices are too low or expected to be higher in the future, so they delay that actual production. We've seen production peak about 1.2 million barrels per day, which is a lot of oil, mind you. But that's going to begin to decline, and actually pretty precipitously over the next 2 or 3 years if we don't see an uptick in prices. One of the interesting things about the Bakken formation is that we have a really fast depletion rate. That is, the first 2 or 3 years result in most of the production out of a particular well. It varies from well to well and what part of the formation you're in, but we're going to see that number drop, which is actually a good thing because if prices are low, the market's telling you not to produce, and so we can actually stop producing naturally. Talking about next steps, a conference is being planned. Had our first conference call a few weeks ago, and I think we have the next one on Monday. Looking at having a research conference, really practitioner-oriented. There's a lot of local stakeholders who are looking for help. So these would be city, county leaders, maybe some state leaders who would be there. Obviously, even though it's sparsely populated, you still need 6 people on the county commission, and so those numbers do add up pretty quickly. And really, what the idea is to have a meeting of researchers who are doing practical research on many of these impacts, and those local stakeholders and champions who can benefit from it. Just like with the convening we had last May, the primary host would be the Strom Center at Dickinson State and the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. One thing we'd like to do is see experts from around the country. So if you happen to be in Michigan or Ohio and work in energy, and there's a few folks who are now doing that, to learn from those lessons or to share our findings from research here in the Northern Plains with you. I can't underemphasize how important the initial convening was, and then also to go around with that is the support that we got from the center. I received a number of positive comments from researchers who, recognize the importance of the travel support to get them to Dickinson. Travel dollars are relatively tight, and even though it's a great idea, when resources are tight, you have to make decisions. But having that travel support available, and again, it came from the center, that really helped the convening be successful and also lead to the ultimate research meeting held later this year to be successful. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sure Aaron is too.
Thank you, David and Aaron. If you would like to ask any questions, you can do so. For the audience, you can do that in the chat section down here. One of the questions that I have is I hear about the potential risks in terms of the environmental problems associated with all of this. Can you give me an example of a significant, maybe an issue that has arisen on the environmental side, or has it been, so far been pretty contained?
Oh, we've had a number of events in the state. We've had oil spills or damaged lines. We've had fracking fluid, saline fluid, dirty filter socks. We've had exploding trains. It has not been without significant environmental costs. A lot of people are happy to ignore those. We have a state government that is very pro-economic development, and so we do have rules on the books to oversee or to regulate activity, as well as to impose fines. And we haven't been quite as tough on many of these events as we could be, according to the rules. And so, there have been many events. Many of them have been significant. I'm sitting in Fargo right now. There was an explosion of an oil train, 10 or 12 miles outside of town about 2 years ago. So I would consider that significant. People not properly disposing of spent fracking fluid, the dirty socks, which it's hazardous waste, and it's got minor. They're somewhat radioactive. There's a lot of things that have been going on, and so again, that's not really my focus, but those stories have been there. I think that they can be, there's the actual numbers, and they could be overhyped, and they could also be minimized depending on your perspective.
Yeah, I was on an airplane, and I started talking to the guy next to me who was a truck driver in the Bakken, and he would go back and forth between Oregon and North Dakota for his work. But he carried water, but he said if you had just even a small drop of some of that water or fluid, they had to be very careful, and they had to dig up all of the dirt around it to make sure that they got everything.
Yeah, and the fracking fluid is stuff you wouldn't want to drink, and it's stuff you don't want to just scatter about. It's not the worst thing in the world, okay. But there are certainly costs like that. The other issue I completely ignored was the flaring of gas, and so when you tap these wells, there's associated gas in these formations, and since we don't have the infrastructure in place to collect that gas, we've allowed the companies that are developing the Bakken to flare most of that. And so I'm sure you've seen, pictures or stories about that. And it's a massive amount of natural gas.
Yeah.
But a lot of it aligns with the philosophy taken by the state, which is that they wanted to support the development, and that with the eventuality that regulations would pick up, and that we would deal with those things. We do have rules on the books that say you must capture that gas within a certain period of time, and those rules have not been stiffly enforced.
David and Aaron, do you see that comment by Glenn?
Yes, I do. Yep. Yeah, yeah, the significant environmental impacts, kind of across the board, in addition to just dealing with all of these people and dealing with things properly. And the comment from Kurt, yeah, everybody for the last 5 years up until, a few months ago, everyone's saying that this time it's different. But we have so much that we can learn from one another from the past, and then also at the same time with other tight oil development, be it in the Marcellus or Eagle Ford. And that's one reason why we need to have, more events like this, because learning has been done. And it's one thing, from an academic sense what this learning is, but I mean there are real significant human and environmental costs in this type of activity. And I think in many respects, and I mentioned it earlier, that people thought that this time it was going to be different. And then it's not. You can almost, go from one resource boom and bust to the next and find many, many similarities.
Yeah. Well, for the participants, you can see the summary evaluation. We really appreciate it if you give us feedback on the seminar. And Aaron and David, thank you very much for the presentation. Real interesting stuff and a lot of challenges, opportunity and challenges, I guess.
And thank you so much for the invitation. And again, on behalf of everyone who attended the initial convening for the travel support, I mean, it was absolutely fundamental to the level of success that we did have, and for the conference that we're going to have later this fall.
Great.